Did it work?
Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I added one more link today, which was, this one has been there already, since day one. And I finally figured out, how to use, Linux Samba so that you can share files with a Windows NT domain. It was not too difficult, but it does involve, quite a few configurations. So instead of focusing on the details today, which we probably cannot really test anyway because it's really hard to test, you have to have a domain up and running already. We'll go ahead and skip this topic for the time being and just go all the way to Linux security tool, which is in topic 12. This is a summary of a lot of different tools, and I have a little brief summary for each one. And we can go ahead and install and play with some of these. Not all of these will work inside a virtual machine, which I have tested already. Some of these will work, just fine, and some of these will not work in the virtual machine because of version differences. Okay, so the first topic has to do with baseline hardening, which is basically, all the simple tools that you can install in a system to help you improve the security of your Linux installation. These are all free. Okay, I'm only including the tools that are part of the Debian distribution. So these are all packages that you can install in any Debian installations. The first one is called Bastille, and it's a distribution-specific hardening tool, which is part of the problem. Your virtual machine is using Debian 5.0, and the included Bastille package of Debian will only work up to 4.0. So that's why you can try to install it, but when you try to run Bastille, it's not going to work. What I can do is I can go into my home machine. I can show you what it looks like when you run it properly. So let me log into my home box here. Okay, to run Bastille, you just have to run Bastille. If I run it like this, it will try to use the GUI version. If you specify -c, it will run the text version, which is great because now you can run it remotely without using any graphical user interface. This is the first screen you will see. The first time you run it, it will be slightly different. It will tell you that this is the first time you run Bastille, and it will just tell you that okay, these are the instructions. It will guide you through step by step. This is a fairly interesting program, unless you have taken some other classes on top of this one, such as networking classes or the Linux administration class, ciss323 or 324. Some of the questions presented by Bastille is a little hard to answer because you won't understand the impact of the answer to the question very easily. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the questions. First question is, would you like to set more restrictive permissions on the administration utilities? Now, this is an interesting question because it shows you some examples here. These utilities, okay, in general, the default file permissions set by most vendors are fairly secure. To make them more secure, though, you can remove non-root user access to some administrator functions. Okay, and it gives you a brief list of what kind of utilities are we talking about. It includes a linuxconf, fsck, which is file system check, ifconfig, run level, and port map. Now, some of these commands I can definitely see that for a non-root user, there's really no need to run it. On the other hand, some of these tools, I can still see someone trying to run like fsck on something that is not a drive, not a system drive, not a partition. Okay, you can basically remap a single file to a loopback device, and you can check the file system on the loopback device, and that does not really cause any system security concerns. The other one is ifconfig. ifconfig stands for interface config, which is basically your networking tool to check, okay, is my networking up and running? Okay. In other words, you can use ifconfig to change your IP address. You can use it to change your network address and so on and so forth. But you can also just use it to list the interfaces that are up and running, the MAC addresses and whatnot. So to me, I use it, as an end user, just to check the network status and not to change anything. If you take that away, then no user can do that unless they change to root first. Okay. So the way I selected the answer for this particular question is just no, because some of these commands I actually do need access to it, and you can specify no. Now the thing about Bastel is you can always come back and answer the same questions again, but answer them differently. So if you answer no right now, it's not like you will break the system permanently, because you can always come back and change your settings. But it will be a good idea to remember what it was before you change it. Are there any questions about this particular question? All it is doing is removing the read and execute permission of these specific files so that a regular end user cannot access it. You have to be root in order to run some of these commands. Any questions? No questions? If you press the enter key, it just moves on to the next question. And this is the second part is a whole category of questions. The following questions all pertain to disabling SUID root permission for particular programs. Now this is an interesting concept, but also at the same time fairly dangerous. SUID stands for set user ID, which basically means if I run some of these programs, the program will be run using the root privilege and not my own privilege. Okay, so that means it's fairly dangerous. Now, most of these programs are smart enough to check what I want to do is something that can be done or not. Let me give you one particular example here. If you press the enter key, it will move on to next. Okay, so here is one. Should Bastel disable clear text R protocols, which stands for remote protocols that use IP-based authentication? The default answer is yes, and I 100% concur to the recommendation. In other words, you should never have clear text protocols running in your system for authentication purposes. Uh-oh, another nuclear meltdown. Shouldn't be making jokes out of that, but I just could not resist. Okay, so this is a definite yes. Okay, you really don't want to use clear text for authentication in any situation on any workstation that is networked. If the workstation is not networked, even so, clear text authentication can still be a problem, but not as much. So in this case, I would definitely select yes. And besides, most of these programs like RLogin, RShell, and so on and so forth, they are outdated already. They're mostly deprecated utility programs that exist in the system just for historical reasons or for backward compatibility. Most of these can now be done by, guess which program? We have used that program already, SSH. Okay, SSH can replace most, if not all, of these programs. And any program that previously used the R protocol utility programs can now use SSH. So getting rid of these programs is not a big deal. So you should definitely answer yes. If the program, if your system cannot be used, for whatever reason, after this, you have to revisit and see whether you can use SSH in place of RLogin, RShell, and so on. Okay, this one here is to ask you whether you want to enforce password aging. Password aging means you will have to set a certain period of time, and end users will have to change their passwords after that amount of time. So what do you guys think?
Yes.
It's yes and no, because if you set it to, is to disable the account when the password hasn't changed in 99,999 days. That's the default behavior. This interval is too long to be useful. We can set the default to 60 days. Now 60 days, I think, is actually not, is too frequent. It depends on what you use your system for, and also depends on what you're storing on the system or who is using the system. A lot of times, if you force people to change password more than twice a year or something like that, people would just go through all kinds of tricks to basically reuse the same password, or they would select passwords that are systematic. There's a way to derive the next version of the password based on time, date, and whatnot. Yep.
So I know at least in the Windows environment, they track your previous password history. They don't allow you to use anything too similar. Does that have a feature similar to that?
Yes.
It does.
Oh, you can with Linux you can crank it all the way up, just like you can with Windows. You can enforce how many letters, minimum number of letters. You can enforce the use of punctuation, uppercase, lowercase, digits. You can enforce the lack of any dictionary word inside that big mess. You can enforce the number of letters or the number of positions that are different from the previous password. Yeah, you can do all that stuff. It gives it's just not turned on by default. But if you crank it up, you can crank it up all the way. And for many people, it's hard enough to generate one password, okay, that satisfies all the requirements. And if you ask them to do the same thing every 2 months, that's going to be a problem.
For you, yeah, because you're going to be resetting their passwords constantly.
The only way to get around that is to have a random password generator, and then people will have to have a key ring to basically look up the password to a particular system. Now, related to this story, I actually went to try to find keyring devices, little LED devices that will let you kind of like key in something that is not USB connected, and also
it generates a random set of numbers and pushes a button.
okay, but does it store the number?
That's dual factor though, right? That's like a citrus token or something.
Yeah, it's a token thing I got from my online game that I don't want to play. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
just
but-
for dual factor authentication.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not for storing, passwords. And remember what I said, you can use your Android phone or your iPhone, and install a, keyring app on it. But if you do that, even if the app itself is not malicious, it does not intend to send the password to anybody else. If someone hacks into your phone, they can potentially grab all your passwords, because, it is a network connected device. So I have been looking for something that cannot be connected to anything, 3G, Wi-Fi, or even USB, and I could not find such a device. Okay.
Standalone key generation.
Yep, basically a standalone PDA, if you will. Okay, but it is so dumb that you cannot. There's no way to talk to it unless you punch the keys or read the LCD screen, and there's no such device that I can find.
Why don't you build one yourself?
I've got an old Palm Pilot you can have.
There you go, yeah.
Old Palm Pilot would do that. It will still talk through a serial port, except it's harder to find serial ports these days to talk to it to begin with.
I've got one in the box still if you want it.
You can get a USB to serial port converter, and those things work fairly well too. So, but the bottom line is, if you do something like this and you crank up the difficulty of the passwords, it may be counterintuitive, counterproductive in the end. So I will leave this part up to you guys to decide, because ultimately it depends on what you are doing on the system. If it is a control system of a nuclear plant, yes. Okay? If it's the control system of air traffic control system, yes. On the other hand, if it is your home workstation that your kids use to log in to Club Penguin, okay, then I think it may not be necessary. So all depends on what you use the workstation for. Any questions or comments regarding this one?
I think if the password is at least 10 characters long, they shouldn't have to reset it at all.
I have another tool later on that we'll talk about passwords on its own. It's join, and also there's another program called Snip. So we'll talk about passwords later on. But for now, this one is up to you guys to decide if you want to turn it on. It's okay, but it can be a little bit annoying to a lot of end users. How many of you are admins of a system for corporations already? And do you guys have policies like that you have to change passwords?
Oh yeah, 90 days.
90 days?
Has to be 11 characters, caps lower least one special character.
Okay. Now, how many characters have to be changed from one version of the password to the next?
That I don't know. The security officer keeps that under wraps.
Okay.
They just say it has to be significantly different, and if it kicks it back, they make you try again until you get one that works. I don't know what the exact threshold is. They don't release that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A lot of places it's 8 to 10 characters, 90 days or 120 days, and then a lot of times, especially like on Windows boxes, they tend to be you can't use the last 3 passwords. But I've been in places where it's been pretty tight. Where like, you couldn't use the last 10. Any combination.
Well, I have to tell you this story. One of my colleagues, computers, science, professors, figure out how to get around this thing. So he has a selection of, some, 20 passwords, and, of the 20 passwords, he would rapidly go through the change password thing 10 times so that he can go back to the first password. He just overflows the queue, so the system can no longer track which password or the 11th password from the past, and he would just go back and use the same password again. So I'm just saying that if this is if it's tightened up too much, people would just find ways to get around it, which basically defeats the whole purpose originally anyway. So this is up to you guys to decide. It's hard to say. It's difficult to make one single solution for everybody. The next one is: would you like to restrict the use of cron to administrative accounts? Now this is interesting. Cron is a very harmless little system service, okay? Because all it does is to say, oh, I'll let you run specific scripts, okay, or specific commands at particular times, and you just tell me, what time, what day, what month, that you want to run the script, and I can do it. The system will run your scripts using only your permissions. Okay, so there's no privilege elevation here. There's no access to the root account. You can just run whatever you can run normally. Okay, so the cron job has the same restrictions as you normally do with the shell. Okay, so why do you think this is bad, in a system? Why is this not a good feature to enable?
You can enable malicious scripts to escape.
Okay, that is true. That's the first step. It enables malicious script to be run autonomously. But you can run it. You can just log in and run your malicious script anyways. So why would this be a bad idea? Yep.
If you're not paying attention to like the logs and it happens when you're not there and you can't see it gets by you.
Mm-hmm. But if you do it autonomously, then you can run it every minute, and you can try to catch something in the system that otherwise would escape people most of the time. Very good. That is exactly the reason. So let's think about how you can mount a file system such as Samba. Okay, you use the command mount. Okay, and then you specify the share device or the share name, and then you can supply your username and the group name. There's an option to also supply the password as a part of the command line. Okay, you can do the same thing with MySQL. Okay, when you try to log into MySQL, which is a database program, you can also supply the username and the password on the command line in order to log into the system. Now that is bad because if you run PS, with a certain option, and I cannot remember exactly which option, but that's why we have man pages. But if you run PS with a certain option, it shows the entire command line. Whatever people type on the command line to run the program, it shows the entire one. In other words, if someone mounts a Samba partition or Samba mount point to the system, and at that moment, you run a script that has a PS command, post a process list command, and capture it to a text file, you can potentially grab the password. Okay, just potentially. Now, if you know approximately what time the system mounts a Samba, mount point for backup purposes or for whatever purposes, if you can narrow down the time frame to, let's say, 1 or 2 seconds, you can run your script so it just runs PS continuously, for 50 times, 100 times, 200 times. Okay, so hopefully one of those 200 times will catch the mount command that has the password as a part of the command line itself. Are you guys seeing what I'm saying? Okay, but you cannot do it manually, because if you do it manually, first of all, it will be very suspicious, because they can see when you log in, okay, and two, the timing has to be exactly right, and you have to be up at the time when the system is mounting that particular mount point. Now I'm saying this because I have seen systems doing exactly that. Okay, I have seen one system particularly that runs a script in order to mount a backup mount point, every night at 2 a.m. or something like that, and then it will tar all the files into the backup partition or the backup mount point. And potentially, if I run a script to do the PS thing, I can actually see that. Now the worst part is, what if the command fails for some reason, or hangs up for some reason? Then it stays there forever. That would be bad as well. So that's why enabling cron job for regular end users can be bad news, especially for systems that are already weak in terms of security. This is just enabling end users to hack into the rest of the system pretty easily. So I would turn that off. Now, if you read the rest of this page here, it says if you want to specifically allow certain users to set up cron jobs, you can specify the names of those users in /etc/cron.allow. In other words, you are not losing the flexibility to let non-root users to run their cron jobs. You are just having the control over who can run those jobs and who cannot run those jobs. Okay, so this is definitely a yes for me, and I recommend people to do exactly the same on their systems. Okay, the third one, the other question is, do you want to set the default UMask? Okay. Now the UMask is one of the things that will control the default permissions when you create a file. If you log in as a regular user and you say vi and then the file name, the file will be created with certain default permissions. The default permission of almost every Linux distribution is user can read write, group, which is usually the user himself or herself, can read write, and others can read. Okay, that's the usual default. So what you can do is to enable that feature, enable this feature, and the next screen gives you several options. Now these things are actually kind of convoluted because it is telling you what you want to lock out and not what you want to allow. But that's okay because each number has an explanation next to it. The first one is everyone can read your files and people in your group can alter them. And this is the default. Okay, the default is others cannot write to your file. And that's the only protection. Other people can read it, but they cannot change it. Okay, which is the weakest protection, and that's the system default in a lot of systems. The second one is everyone can read your files, but no one can write to them, not even the group, which is okay in most cases because most of the time the group owner of a file is the same as the user owner, which means that the group owner really does not do anything important in the system. The next one is only people in your group can read your files. No one can write to them except you and the root user, obviously. Now, if you do this, you have to, it's a good setting. Okay, it's a good setting from a certain perspective because nobody else in the system can read your files. Okay, which is good. It is more secure. But at the same time, this applies to every single file that you create unless you use chmod to change the mod bit of your files. So you have to be careful when you do this, especially if you're on a web server. Because when you're on a web server, Apache has to be able to read your files, right? In order for Apache to go to your directory and serve up your web pages, it has to have some kind of read access to your files. So let me ask you this question. How do you think Apache can gain access to your HTML documents that you want to publish to the entire world?
Part of the right group. Part of the Apache group or whatever you mean.
Okay, there are two ways. Okay, you're absolutely right, Theo. There are two ways to do it. Apache can either use the www-data user group in order to access your file, which means using the 2 in the middle will still be okay because the group still has read access to it, or it can go through others to access your files. But hold on a second here. Apache is a system daemon how come it is not running as root in order not to need any permission and still be able to read your files? What do you think?
It's on the network. You don't want to give people that kind of access to it.
You don't want Apache to have got that kind of access, because if Apache has any type of security flaw and people can gain access and control Apache, if Apache has root privileges, that means whoever gained control over Apache will also have root privileges, and that would be really bad. Okay, and that's why Apache on almost every single system is only run using, as the user either nobody or www-data, which has very limited access to the rest of the system. So in case Apache itself is compromised, it can only do limited damage to the rest of the system. So I would, if you have anything like that, if you are running a web server, and end users are to publish their web files, I would not go to 077, because 077 means only the user owner can access it, and Apache in that case will have no way to access the files, and you cannot publish anything on the web. Okay, is that okay so far? So which setting is appropriate depends on what you use the system for, whether it is a multi-user system. If the system only has you as a user, hey, you can crank it all the way up and it should not cause any problems. But if you're sharing files with other people on the same system, then you might want to consider some of the other options too. But I know 077, for one thing, is not appropriate for anything that publishes files to the internet. In other words, if you take if you're taking a class on the Power server, in order to publish your HTML documents and I crank it all the way up on the Power server, there would be no documents that would be visible from the outside. Any questions about this? Any questions? So I'm going to switch back because I don't want to change my system, at least for now. Okay, the next question is, should we disallow root login even on the hardwired console TTLs? Console TTL 1 to 6 corresponds to what you get when you type Control-Alt F1 all the way to Control-Alt F6. So these are basically physical access to the keyboard and the screen. We are not talking about remotely logging in. We're not talking about SSH. This is physical access. So if you think that someone may try to hack into your system, and that person may have physical access to your computer, you have to kind of consider turning this one on. Okay, enabling this or disallowing root login even on the physical console means that in order for someone to get to the root level, they have to first log in as you or some user in the system. Then they can do the su command and then supply the root password. So even if they know the root password, they still have to know the password of one other user in order to gain access to the system, which gives you just one more level of protection, but it is one more level of protection. So if you want to turn it on, it doesn't do any harm. Okay, the only harm that it does is the lack of the convenience of being able to log in as root, from the hardware console, and that's about it. Are there any questions about this part here? Okay, questions? So moving on. Would you like to password protect the grub prompt? The grub prompt is basically what you see when the system starts up. On the virtual machine, it will ask you, which operating system do you want to log in as? Do you want to use when you start up the system? If you do not password protect the grub prompt, you can look online and you can find out all kinds of ways to start up your Linux kernel and have it not ask the password of root, so that you can go in and change the password of root itself. Okay. In other words, it's really that easy to bypass the security if someone wants to break into your system and you don't password protect your grub prompt. But that's only given that you do not encrypt your entire partition. Now, since we did encrypt the entire partition, someone gaining control over grub will still not have access to the rest of the system because they cannot get into the rest of the system. It's all encrypted. So that means if you encrypt the entire partition like what we did in this class, this may not be necessary anymore. If you enable this feature, you have to kind of read the second part here. This option can interfere dual booting with a second operating system, since dual booting often requires that to type an operating system name to boot to one of the two operating systems. So this may be something that you have to consider too, is if you enable this feature, you can no longer let an end user dual boot, because the end user would not have the password to get into Grub to select which operating system they want to boot to. Okay. Any questions? The partition encryption technique that we use in this class still allows you to dual boot or triple boot or quadruple boot your system. It's just that the system that has the encrypted partition, it will require the password to log in. This one will basically lock out all the other systems too. Would you like to disable control all delete rebooting, which is the default behavior? The default behavior is if you're on the console and you type control all delete, the system will automatically reboot. So that can be bad if someone has physical access to a computer and try to break into your system. So you want to say yes if you suspect someone maybe trying to break into your system and that person has physical access to your computer. Okay. Any questions about this one? Any questions? Moving on. Would you like to set a default deny to any TCP wrapper and XNetD? XINetD is basically a super daemon. We talked about what a super daemon is earlier in the semester. But this one is kind of dangerous because you're disabling everything that's going through XNetD, XINetD. And they give you a list here of what type of command or what type of surface can be going through XINetD. And let's see here. That includes Telnet, which is a bad protocol to support anyway. FTP, which is a bad protocol to support anyway. POP can be useful. Okay, POP is typically not installed on a workstation. It is usually installed on a server. IMAP is basically POP but different. It's a different protocol for the same purpose. Finger and a whole number of other surfaces. So if you turn on this feature, you have to make sure that there are no useful surfaces that are provided by the super daemons. And do you still remember which configuration file to look in order to see what surfaces are offered through inetd? /etc/inetd.conf. That's the file that you have to read to see what kind of surfaces are being offered through inetd. Should Bastel ensure the telnet surface does not run on this system? And the answer is yes. Okay, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever that someone should enable telnet to run on a system. Should Bastel ensure inetd's FTP surface does not run on the system? And the answer is yes again, because once again, what you can do with telnet and also FTP can also be done by SSH and SFTP, which are much more secure protocols. So definitely want to answer yes to this question. Would you like to put limits on system resource usage? It's not a bad idea, but I think you can effectively cripple most denial of service attacks. So that's good because it limits how much resources can be used by a particular client.
Does it actually disable, say if you're running a web server and someone's doing a denial of service attack against that, does it actually disable the web server or just certain IP addresses, or how does that work?
Well, let's see here. I think it does not address which IP you're dealing with. For what you just said, you have to use a PSAD or Snort. Those two can identify where they're coming from. And as a result, you can specify a rule and say, okay, if I detect this many requests coming from this particular IP address within this kind of frame of time, block that address. You can do that with Snort or PSAD, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. This one is more global. I believe if if the system detects that there are 150 Apache instances, it would just shut down Apache altogether for a certain amount of time and then re-enable it. So the denial of service will still, quote unquote, succeed in stopping Apache from running on that system, but it's not stopping the other stuff from going on that system. Okay. Next one. Should we restrict console access to a small group of user accounts? And the justification is, user log in at the console have some special access right, like the ability to mount the CD-ROM drive. So I don't think it's a big deal. Yes or no. It's not going to have a major impact to the security of the system. Would you like to set up process accounting? Now this is kind of interesting because on the surface it sounds really good because you can keep track of who has been using how much processing power, how much RAM, how much disk space, and so on and so forth. But the downside is it is very CPU and disk intensive. In other words, if you don't have a system that has a lot of spare resources to begin with, turning this on will just take everything away. Okay, so everybody ends up with not enough resources in the system. Miscellaneous daemons. To make the operating system more secure, we try to deactivate all system services or system daemons. So you might want to take a look at the list here because it's a big list, and some of these items are kind of questionable. Do you really want to turn it off? The first one is ACPID or APND, for power management. They say that this is only used to monitor battery power and are used mostly exclusively by notebook/laptop computers, but that's not entirely true. Okay, that is not entirely true. ACPI is also used, other than for power controls. It's also used for thermal control and some other things. So I don't think you want to normally turn these things off, even though it can help improve the security of the system. Now this part is interesting because it kind of relates to what we were just talking about a little bit earlier about Samba. We would like to disable the network file system NFS and SMB for Samba because NFS is already well known for not being very secure, and Samba is only a little bit better according to this article here. Well, if you turn off NFS, which stands for Network File System, and you turn off Samba, which is Windows Share, how are you going to share files with another system? SSH. Okay? Now, it's not as transparent. If you use SSH to share files, it is not nearly as transparent as Samba or NFS, but it is a lot more secure. Okay? Can someone name a client program that can use SSH or Sftp to basically download a file from another system?
FileZilla.
FileZilla is one. Another one maybe?
The built-in Nautilus file system on Ubuntu can do it.
How about in Windows? If I have a Windows client box and somebody else is running a Linux box, and that person says, "Oh, come grab my photo directory. I got some pictures. You can download." What else can we do? SCP. Yep. So there are alternatives. Okay, there are alternatives out there that you can use in order to share files. Now with SFTP, let's just say that you want to let somebody download a file, but you don't want that person to be able to log in and start to run commands. You can actually do that. Okay, what we have done in this class about SSH is really just scratching the surface of what you can do with SSH. SSH, the daemon, can place a lot of restrictions as to how people can use SSH. For instance, you can say that for this particular user, these are the only commands that person can run when that person authenticates through SSH. You can force people to log in not by password, but by the key pair file, the public key file. So SSH actually can do a lot more than what we have talked about in this class, and it's a good alternative to sharing files, using Samba or NFS. And then later on, says here, these services are safer if you can set your firewall to block packets for either of them from entering or leaving your network. But it is probably best, to probably disable it. How many people do not have a residential gateway? So your computer hooks up to a DSL modem, and the DSL modem goes out to immediately. Okay.
No, I do.
I used to. Okay. So do you notice that you can see your neighbors, share invitations? Yep. Okay. Now Linux doesn't do that, but if you have Windows, and someone accidentally say, "Oh, I want to share this folder," it will automatically tell the entire world and say, "Hey, I got something to share. How about you guys?" Okay. And that's not good. That is not good. But then someone would say, but that's not right. The computer should not let WAN, the wide area network, to have access to Samba and the file systems and stuff like that. If you hook up your computer directly to a DSL modem, or cable modem, or Shore West, little box, and then that hooks up directly out to Shore West or whatever service provider you have, guess what? All your other customers in your neighborhood that belongs to Shore West or AT&T or the cable company, they are all a part of your, not WAN, they're all a part of your subnet, which is your LAN. And that's why it is okay for Windows to say, okay, I got this entire file drive to share. Who wants to share it? Okay. Now, how do you think I found this out?
Snip around in your neighbor's folders.
No, I don't even have to sniff. Remember, I don't even have to sniff. They asked me, do you want me to share the files? Do you want to look at my files? Okay? Because the moment I turn on my Samba server, my own Samba server will respond to those packets that are broadcasted by the other machines. So my own machine will log all these events and say, okay, this particular machine has this particular share, and and it doesn't really do all the share because I did not configure my machine to automatically mount to those mount points, but I could have. Okay, and that's why they say something like this and say you might want to turn it off or at least configure your firewall to disable incoming packets and also outgoing packets, because just in case your system is trying to invite other people in, you also want to stop that from happening. The next slide talks about stopping SendMail from running in daemon mode. Okay, now if SendMail is not running in daemon mode, how does it get its job done? What is a daemon anyway? Well, a daemon is a service, exactly. It's a program that is running in the background. It has no direct user interface whatsoever, but it can, basically intercept network traffic, TCP/IP connections, and so on and so forth. So if you stop, SendMail from running in daemon mode, it is no longer listening to anything, which is good, because anything that's incoming will not, be triggered, will not trigger SendMail from running anything. If you disable the daemon mode, Bastel will ask you if you'd like to run SendMail every few minutes to process the queue of outgoing mail, and most programs which SendMail will still do so immediately, and processing the queue will take care of the transient errors. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Would you like to deactivate the Apache web server? Because I am running an Apache web server at home. In most cases, if you have Apache running, it's probably for a reason, and you don't want to disable it. Okay. One thing you can do with Apache, which is not something that we have talked about in this class, because typical workstations don't run Apache, is in Apache you can say which interface it is going to interact with. Okay, so you can limit what it can interact with by limiting the interface that it is going to listen to. In other words, if you need Apache to be up and running because you're running a web-based configuration program for something on your system, you can limit the interface to the local host. Okay, so you can leave Apache up and running, but any type of incoming traffic, even if they can make it through your firewall, Apache would just ignore them because they're not coming in from just the local host. They're coming in from a real network port. Okay, so typically you don't have to disable Apache altogether. You can go through some other ways to limit what Apache can do and what it can respond to. There are a few changes that we recommend to make to the web server's configuration. There are very intrinsic security flaws in the Apache web server, but here are the important ones. It's generally required to send and receive information to and from anyone on the internet, and so on and so forth. And it gives you a bunch of options here. Oh, I think I just selected no. Did I? Oh, I think it's just the text. Okay, this part is about printing. Do you want to disable printing? And in most systems, if you have a printer connected and you have the cups, or some other print daemon up and running, you probably don't want to turn it off. Okay, and that's why the default is no. You do not want to disable that. Ftp is widely considered to be fairly dangerous, but even security-conscious sites might still run it because of the perceived difficulty in educating users about alternatives. Trust me, it is not perceived. Okay, it is difficult to tell people do not use Ftp anymore. Okay, it's really hard to tell people to scroll down the drop-down box. Instead of selecting Ftp, select Sftp. Okay, I can tell you that is difficult. Okay, especially when you have people who have prepared notes, screenshots, and whatnot, and have to teach classes that way. So if they have to change the way things are done, they have to retake all the screenshots, at least regarding to how to select file transfer protocols. Yep.
But one of the problems is that there's a lot of equipment out there that doesn't use Ftp, it uses Ftp.
That was true. It is no longer true.
All the cameras I'm dealing with now, like IP cameras, they all use Ftp.
Oh, okay.
They don't use Sftp, which is kind of annoying.
You can limit. I have to look into it. I think you can use. There's a way to block and only allow FTP traffic to come from certain IP addresses. So you can still enable FTP in general, but you can use a file. I cannot remember the name of the file. One is called allow and the other one is .deny. Can anyone remind me what those two files are? It's in /etc.
It depends on what FTP server you're using. Yeah, there's some Pro FTP, which has its own config file where you can do that.
Right. And this one I think is the INET-D type, the one that depends on the super daemon. The super daemon will respect the file that says what IP addresses can come in through which protocol. So in your case, you can still if you know the IP address range of your IP cameras, you can still allow the FTP to come in from the IP cameras, but you can block everything else. But turning on this option will basically turn off FTP altogether. Would you like to install temp-dir temp scripts? Most programs use the temp folder in ways that are dangerous on multi-user systems. Many of these programs will use an alternate directory if one is specified in the temp-dir or temp environment variable. We can install scripts that will be run when user logs in and safely create their own little sandbox for their own temp files. And that's usually a good idea. It is usually a good idea unless you have dedicated a particular drive for all the temp files. Okay, in that case, you have to change the script to change the mount point to that place. So it's a good idea to do this in general. Would you like to run the packet filtering script? And that's a good idea, but this is an older version, so I don't turn it on using this particular program. Packet filtering is basically firewalling. You can set up your own rules to basically place a firewall in software in your system. And you can see how old this is. You know, the script supports both kernel 2.2 and 2.4. It is implied that if it works since 2.4, it will work in 2.6 because IP tables is also supported in 2.6. And if you're finished, you know, you can say yes, and it will make all the changes effective. So if you click yes, it will go ahead and make all the changes effective, give you an idea of who wrote these programs, and you press tab, it will get you out of the program. And that's Pastel. What do you guys think of Pastel? It gives you a baseline, but it does throw a lot of terms at you, doesn't it? Okay, if you have not taken a networking class, if you have not taken a Linux class, just SUID. What is SUID? I mean, what does it do? It gives you an explanation, but the explanation is also kind of terse. So a lot of times, you know, I think if you do not feel sure about, you know, those questions, you may not want to, you know, use Pastel until you know what those, you know, questions are about. You know, what the impacts are when you make a certain decision. I would not run Pastel on a ongoing live system. Okay? As much as I want Power to be a secure server, I would not run Pastel on Power and start to change all these configurations without testing them first. Are there any questions about Pastel? Bastille, whatever. I think it's French. The next one is aid. Aid is a whole lot easier to deal with. Okay, aid is the Debian package name is aid, and you can run this one using the virtual machine, which is kind of cool. This is basically a program to keep track of, you know, whether your critical system files have been modified without you actually initiating the change. So the way it works is when you install, you know, aid, you also have to run a program called aid init. Aid init will basically just initialize, quote unquote, a database. It's not really a database, but they call that a database. It will initialize a database which will, you know, remember all the fingerprints, okay, the hash, you know, values of files, as well as the date stamps, you know, last modification time and whatnot of all the critical system files. So that way, if someone was trying to tamper with their system and change the last modification date or file size or the file signature of those things, any one of those items, and you run aid again, it will tell you that, you know, this particular file used to, you know, be of this size or used to have a modification time of this date and time, and now it is changed. In other words, it's a diff tool. Okay, it shows you the differences in all the changes that have occurred since last time you ran aid init. And you can control what files it keeps track of, you know, all the signatures and timestamps and whatnot. So the way to use this is, you know, you have to run aid init as soon as you install aid, and then before you update the system, you have to run aid again, just to make sure that, you know, nothing unexpected has happened to all the system files. If nothing has happened, you go ahead and update the system. As soon as you update the system, after you update the system, you have to run aid init again so that you update the database so it has the signatures of all the new files after the update. Now, there is one caveat to this whole thing. aid does not encrypt its own database. So that means if I am a hacker and somehow I got access to, you know, I got root privilege, so what I can do is I can change your programs. I can change your ls command, I can change your ps command, I can change a lot of the system commands to make the system really dangerous. But since I am root, I can also go in and change the aid database. Okay, so next time you run aid, it will just report, hey, everything is good, everything matches what I'm expecting, because I changed what it is expecting. Are you guys following the concept? So that's why aid is okay, you know, but you probably want to save, you know, the database onto a read-only media and, you know, put it somewhere off-site. So you can use that to compare to the current, you know, system, so that, you know, someone, you know, the hacker cannot come in and change the database because it is now stored on the read-only device. Okay, so that's the only caveat of using aid. You know, it's really user-friendly, really easy to use, except it has this one little flaw that allows, you know, someone to come in and tweak the database and bypass all the detection mechanisms. Next slide. The next one is called Tripwire. Tripwire is a much more famous program, but it basically does the same trick. But this one is a little bit different because it keeps an encrypted database. And the encryption is a one-way encryption, which means that if you forget the password to that database, there's no way to make Tripwire work again. Yep. Question? No? Oh, okay. Which is good because that means if someone a hacker gains access to the system, decides to change a few files, upload his own version of LS, his own version of PS to my system, that person would not be able to alter the database because the database itself is already encrypted. So that's the strength of Tripwire compared to AID. The only part of Tripwire that is a downside is it is a little bit more difficult to configure. But it's basically the concept. You take a snapshot of the system, and you can check, again and again and again until it is time to update the system. And when it is time to update the system, check right before you update, and then you want to update the database so that your database reflects, the signatures of all the new files. But it's basically the same concept. Are there any questions about AID and Tripwire? Has anyone used similar tools already on Windows? Maybe. Nobody. Then how do you guys make sure that no one has tampered with your system files?
I've done that in Windows.
Okay.
I want to run it all the time, like the files where it's done it for a long time, where you can sign the operating system files.
Right.
Create a signature for all of them, and then you can see if they've changed.
Exactly. That's what.
But people don't usually see that. I mean, I don't even remember if it's like if you can even get to it through the GUI. I don't even know if it was like.
Yeah, Tripwire is a command line program. You just say Tripwire -m to select the mode, and then it's I for init, C for check, and U for update. Which is nice. Anything that has a full command line interface is nice. Why is it nice? Because you can use SSH to do it. You can also set up a cron job to do it. If something only has a GUI interface, if a configuration program only has a GUI interface, how do you make it run automatically? You can probably do it, but it will be very difficult to do. Okay, there are programs that will allow you to automatically interact with a GUI program, but it's not easy at all. Okay. Next one is check rootkit. Okay. It's a basic, simple program to see if a system has a rootkit installed. Okay. Now the question is, do you want to run check rootkit on the system that may have a rootkit installed already? Probably not a good idea. Okay, because what is the whole purpose, or what is the unique feature of a rootkit?
It has full control of the system.
And its main purpose is to cloak itself and possibly other programs. Okay, so if a system already has a rootkit installed, it can possibly cloak itself so that a program like check rootkit cannot find it. So the way to use a check rootkit is to install it on a DVD, a read-only media. So if you suspect a system may have a rootkit installed, you reboot the machine using the read-only live distribution that has check rootkit installed, and then you run check rootkit against the offline system. And that will be a much better way to detect whether a rootkit actually has been installed. And the same thing applies to Windows. Okay? How do you run Windows on a DVD? There's a name for that. What is it? Yep. Sorry?
Windows PE.
Yep. I think it's PE.
Yeah, installation environment.
Yep.
Pre-execution.
Yep. It's a really neat feature that most people do not know that Windows could actually do that. It is perfectly legal to make your own PE edition of Windows out of your own distribution disks.
Network bootable. That's what we use to boot to the network.
And then there's a program to do that. Is it called BART?
Yeah, BART.
Yeah, BART PE. That can also do a.
I don't know if it works with the newer versions.
It doesn't, but there's just another replacement on that one.
And if I remember correctly, Bart can also slipstream, the latest changes onto the PE version, which is kind of neat because you can incorporate all the security updates to the live distribution and use that to check against your installed version on the hard drive. So we have just talked about all the baseline hardening tools. Are there any questions about these tools, or at least the principle, how they work? No questions? Then we'll be moving on to network intrusion detection software. And there are 3 of these, and they're kind of related, not exactly the same. The first one is different. The first one is called PSAD, which is a lightweight intrusion detection program. But its main job, of all the things that you can do, its main job is to detect port scans, backdoors, and DDoS tools. And that's about it. Okay. So it's a lightweight tool. It has a very specific purpose, but at the same time, it does not take up a lot of resources. The next one is called Snort. Okay. Now, Snort is a very powerful tool. You can use it to analyze all kinds of traffic patterns. Okay. And you can also spend all day long, all year long, and make your own career out of writing rules for Snort. Because Snort all by itself is nothing more than an engine, to capture TCP/IP packets, so that you can analyze it later on. And you can write your own rules to specify what you are looking for. If you want to install Snort in Debian, you can either install Snort MySQL or Snort Peak SQL instead of just Snort itself. Because both of these versions will use an actual database to keep track of all the packets, so it will be more efficient in the long run. If you have a larger system, you want to use a database to keep track of the history of all the packets. If you have a small system and the network traffic is not all that much, you can just go with the regular Snort. And I decided, hey, if someone has written something like that already, why do I want to reproduce the same thing? So here's a link to someone else's article, which is actually pretty good as an introduction to Snort. Now the second part about Snort that you have to be aware of, Snort can hog system resources, starting with processing resources. Okay. Now I know this because I used to run a really weak and old server, and I can tell the difference. If I disable Snort, the system is twice as fast. Okay? And the more rules you specify, the slower it goes. Because what it is doing is it is running your packets through all the rules that you have to check against. So the more rules you have, then the more time it takes in order to process the packets. So you definitely don't want to run Snort on a network that is already busy to begin with, unless you absolutely have to, because it will impact performance on your server. Has anyone run Snort before? No? Okay. It's pro-based, and as such, it is going to chew up some processing resources. Now, but you can bypass that limitation by using a hub, okay? And who still has a hub at home, a network hub? Okay? And this is how a hub can come in handy. If you hook up a hub to the computer that you're supposed to monitor and use one of the port on the hub to hook up to a Snort dedicated server, then the Snort dedicated server can monitor all the traffic going in and out of the system that you were actually intending to monitor. So this is one way to basically offload Snort to run it on a dedicated machine, so that the machine it is supposed to monitor does not need any changes at all. Okay, so it's just a little nifty trick to do something like this. Now Snort is also useless unless you have an extensive set of rules that identify what a threat looks like. It will identify many different threats. So it is important to get the most updated and inclusive rules. And you can go to, I think it is snort.com, and you can pay for a subscription service in order to get the most up-to-date rules to detect the latest and greatest threats to networked computers. So someone actually made a living out of writing rules for Snort. Are there any questions about Snort? What about that program that you can use to sniff Wi-Fi packets and figure out the web password of Wi-Fi?
Aircraft.
It's Aircrack, and I think the another one is called Snort.
Yeah,
Yep. We'll get to those programs. Those kind of more intrusive programs. Suricata is basically a snort, but it's a completely rewritten snort from the ground up. For the most part, it is intended as a snort replacement. It can even parse most of the rules intended for snort, but it doesn't really have the same traction that snort has. Not as many people use Suricata compared to snort. Yeah, we're getting there. There's only one more major section to go, which is end user intrusive tools. In other words, some people may not like you running these tools. Okay. The first one is John the Ripper. John the Ripper is a fairly simple program in terms of concept, and its only job is to crack passwords. Okay, great. Okay, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who used a simple password. When I set up my virtual machine, how many people choose something that is either just 1, 2, 3, 4 or a word that you can find in dictionary? You can be honest. It's just a class. Okay. Now, if you did that, it's perfect. Okay, you have just perfectly set up yourself to run John. Okay, install John, and then you say John /etc/shadow, which is where the password file is located. And John will take maybe a few seconds, if it is something that is a dictionary word, to tell you that, oh, I know that person's password is this. Okay? If it runs out of dictionary entries, it will actually go through some other rules to automatically look for popular type of passwords, such as replacing the O with a 0, replacing the I with a 1, that sort of thing. So John actually has some intelligence and figure out the most commonly used passwords. Now, why do I want to run John on my own system that has multiple users?
You forgot the administrator password?
Oh no, my administrator password cannot be cracked by John for sure. I want to see what the other users are using for their passwords. Okay. Because it only takes one user, to have a weak password in order for a system to get compromised. Especially when you're running a website. Okay, if one account on your entire server has a weak password, someone can sneak in, and if they have port 80 visibility, they can still do a lot of damage. You can do phishing and amongst other things if you have port 80 access. Yep.
Is it true that a couple years ago that NASA was actually hacked into someone using John the Ripper?
Sorry?
That's what I heard that NASA was actually hacked into a couple years ago someone using John the Ripper.
Now they have to have the password file in order to use John. So some of them have snuck out the /etc/shadow file, which contains the encrypted passwords, because that's what John needs in order to crack the passwords.
So you have to provide
Yes, John has to be run as a Ruby. That's a good point. Now, John does not just stop there, because when you install John can also be set up to periodically check for weak passwords and send email to alert administrators of which account has weak passwords. So you can do it on a nightly basis. Okay, but it does chew up a lot of processing resources when you run John in this fashion. Okay, but it is possible. Okay, it's possible to do this. Are there any questions about John? What it can do and what it is intended for? No questions. Just install it on your virtual machine and just create a new account with a default password of something that's really simple and see how fast John can crack it, even inside a virtual machine. Okay. The next one, this is the last program that we'll talk about today. It's called Snip. Snip can get an administrator into privacy troubles, okay, because this is what it does. It's a sniffer, kind of like Snort, it is a sniffer. This one specifically sniffs out plain text password and other traffic pattern that may reveal security weaknesses. Okay, so if you read the description of dsniff, it actually has a lot of subcomponents. So it can deal with ARP, it can deal with a lot of not just TCP/IP based protocols. As a packet sniffer, it does not just sniff traffic in and out of a workstation, but also any packets that reaches the workstation itself. In other words, if you use Wi-Fi or if you use a hub to connect to computers, it's not just going to find the passwords of originating from the machine that you're running dsniff from. It will actually find the password, clear text password. Anything that you can see, it will crack. It will basically log and make a note. Let's go ahead and look up dsniff. I just want to show you guys what it can do with dsniff. Okay, so right here, this is the home site of dsniff. It's a collection of tools for network auditing and penetration test. So it consists of file snarf, mail snarf, message snarf, URL snarf. It basically, it's for finding out what people have been doing on your network. Okay, and they passively monitor a network for interesting data, including password, email, files, ARP spoof, DNS spoof, and Mac OF. Facilitating interception of network traffic normally unavailable to an attacker. So it can get someone into trouble. That's all I can say. Now, if you want to test something like this, would you test it on a real network? Probably not a good idea to test it on a real network, especially doing it at work. Okay, so one thing you can do with these programs is to use the tool that we introduced last week, okay? Because remember, the tool that we introduced last week is a switch, it's not a hub, okay? So you cannot really see the traffic of every single workstation, but it is still a switch, which means it is still low level enough to for these tools to actually become useful. So you can actually test these tools and see what you can do with them. Are there any questions at this point? Now, what is the hacker tool that Anonymous used when they hacked into HB Gary's website? It's called the low orbit something cannon. Ionic, that's it. Okay, low orbit ionic cannon, and that's supposed to be a penetration test, utility program, and they were able to use that to crack HB Gary's website. I'll just go ahead and take a quick look here, and that's the end of today's lecture. That's the end of the 8 weeks. Low orbit ionic. Oh, misspelled cannon. So here's the documentation on LOIC. It's an open source network attack application written in C# of all languages. Was initially developed by Pratox Technology, but it was released to the public domain later on. So I guess this is something that you can use to point to a particular website just to see how well that website can defend itself. It can launch denial of service attack by flooding the server with TCP packets, UDP packets, or HTTP requests with the intention of disrupting the service of a particular host. People have used LOIC to join voluntary botnets. And I think Anonymous was actually using many installations of LOIC when they brought the HB Gary website down. Have you guys followed that storyline?
I did at the beginning. I stopped following it after a while.
I know that they used I know they used the LOIC on MasterCard, but I'm not 100% sure they used it on HB Gary. Yep.
I don't think that's how they got in. They used
Social engineering, right?
They used a cross-site scripting attack to get through their main page, and then from that they just used weak passwords, and they used the same password on the mail server as the other one. Some other dumb stuff.
Yeah, there was like some part of it that got through. I think they said there was like the main thing that got through was just some like SQL injection thing, some like really basic SQL injection thing. That should have been blocked. I mean, you know, it was like a wide open door, like no brainer.
But they did use LOIC on someone. You know, did they use it on MasterCard?
Yeah.
Okay, that must be it.
The RIA website.
Yeah, the RA is one of them too. Yep. All right. Well, that's all that I have for today, which is the entire end of the semester. So I will probably still talk a little bit about these things, using video clips. You guys can watch it if you want to, or just ignore that if you want to. But that's the end of this class. If anyone has any particular questions, and you want me to cover a particular topic, I will be more than happy to, look into that, given that I have time to do it. So the class is officially done as far as grading is concerned. I have to finish grading that last, assessment thing. Yep.
Have you ever looked at App Armor for Linux?
App?
It's called App Armor.
App Armor. No, I have not.
It's the only thing I know of that is helpful in defending against zero-day attacks.
Well, let's take a look.
There's also SCQ.
Okay. Okay, so you have to define what an application. Basically, it defines what an application
You have
can.
to set up profiles for each application.
Right.
But it's pretty interesting.
That's interesting. It also requires, from what I have just read up to this point, it requires kernel support as well.
Oh, really?
It looks that way.
Yeah, Linux security modules.
It requires the Linux security modules kernel interface. So you have to have that already compiled into a kernel in order to use App Armor.
That's something I use. So.
Now, do you have to configure every single app, or do you just have to configure the apps that you think can have a problem?
The only one that's installed now is the printer name and what it's called, like cups.
Yeah, cups.
That's the only thing that's set up. Some people have uploaded their profiles. You can find them online, but for the most part, you have to set it all up yourself.
Now, would you do this to ls? Like you just regular commands like ls or
No,
mb?
for me, this is something I would do with like Firefox or stuff that is going to be exposed and has had problems in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's like even if Firefox has some sort of exploit that someone is able to run against you, they can't really do anything with it after that.
Okay, I see.
So it's the only thing I know of to defend against zero-day attacks that is actually useful.
Now, does it impact the performance of the system? Because any type of armor, means that the application has to go through a few more hoops in order to do something.
There can be a few problems with it, like you're restricting that application to only certain folders or whatever, so you can have problems with temporary files and stuff like that. But as far as performance after getting it set up, I would say no.
Okay, so you haven't noticed anything in terms of performance change?
You could read a little more about how it works and how it restricts the programs.
Say, how does it do it? Is it just check for specific profile changes, or
Basically, it restricts what that application has access to. What
Okay, so right here, it says right here.
necessarily intrusion detection, prevention,
pretty much, yeah.
Now, for some reason, it targets, cups, particularly. Is there a reason? I mean, is
Because
cups
it
particularly
had
in?
this huge problem for so long, and that was their
Okay.
fix, I think.
Okay. So it does go through a virtual machine of sorts in order to get its job done.
mean, I'm sure there probably is some sort of performance hit, you know, if you're using it for everything. But in my experience, I haven't noticed.
Well, it's sandboxing, right? I mean, that's what it's doing technically, right?
Yeah.
It's sandboxing, so it's got to create an instance for each thing that it's sandboxing. So after a while, you're gonna start using up memory, and you can see what you're gonna go from there. But
did you have to recompile your kernel or install a special
I
kernel?
didn't, no.
Or is automatically supported already?
Yeah, it was supported,
Okay.
but I was running it on Ubuntu, not in the just regular Debian. So
They're close enough for me.
yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah.
You know. I don't know.
Okay, well, cool. Thanks.
I usually just run
Mhm.
a virtual machine that has like no file sharing access, no, like anything like that.